that we have some important lessons to share with other regions that are in the process of either negotiating agreements or have interim agreements, since the Caribbean is the only region thus far that has a comprehensive EPA. And we say that it's comprehensive because it includes a whole range of what we would call these additional issues, services, public procurement, investment, competition, etc., which weren't necessarily really required in the context of WTO compatibility. But the region went ahead and agreed to the inclusion of these issues within its economic partnership agreement. So I'm going to share a couple of lessons, particularly around the issue of participation and participation of civil society, and how that played out within the region, and what it is that we can learn from in the context of these post-Cotonou negotiations. So I think that the first kind of key lesson coming out of the Caribbean is that participation was not necessarily an explicit part of the process. That is, the negotiators and our governments, in the context of looking at a structure for the negotiations, did not include a space for civil society. So there was no institutionalized framework for civil society to participate. And that is important. It is important because for us it suggested what we call a democratic deficit within the process. And therefore, we only were allowed space, based on continual kind of resistance and continual kind of insistence in terms of our participation. So for me, the lesson going forward here is that as we look at how civil society should be involved in the ongoing negotiations, is that we have to make sure that there's an institutionalized framework for our participation. And not only that there is an institutionalized framework, but that we decided, so that we are proactive in terms of deciding what that framework should look like, as opposed to having it being decided for us. I think the second kind of key lesson is how do we make sure that we bring those voices of our constituents to bear in the discussions. And when I say the voices of our constituents, one of the things that we need to be able to guard against is the elite approach that we can sometimes have within civil society. And when I say elite approach, I mean there are a group of us that will have access to the negotiations, right? That can sit at the table with the negotiators, and because we may be more technically minded, can engage the text. If we stay with that approach, what tends to happen is that we divorce or divide the process from the key kind of stakeholders that we're supposed to be representing. And one of the things that worked for us, even in terms of leveraging our voice, was to make sure that we very, very frontally included the voices of women, of farmers, of small business people and stuff, so that they actually got to be able to sit at the negotiating table and got to be listened to as well. And we were very clear throughout the process that our representation was for a wider constituency, and we demonstrated that. So we had a continual engagement of protest on the street that involved those kinds of stakeholders, so that our negotiators were continually reminded of them. So I think that's an important thing. I think the kind of third lesson is about how do we leverage our global and ACP networks as well, right? So I think that one of the successes that we had within the CARIFORUM region in terms of civil society is that we very much leveraged our alliances with NGOs in Europe, who provided us again with access to information, access to documents that we would not have had. And then we also built solidarity across Africa and across the Pacific as well, so that we lent support to their efforts, they lent support to us. And it meant then that as civil society, we were speaking with a voice. So even when I spoke from the Caribbean perspective, we were able to say that this is a shared view across all of the ACP countries. And I think that is an important kind of strategy that we need to be able to continue to leverage. In the context of implementation, and I'll share three very quick lessons here. again, because we have a comprehensive agreement that we are implemented, actually 10 years now into implementation, since we officially signed off in October of 2008. One has to do with the cost of implementation. I think that there was not sufficient attention paid to what it would actually cost countries to actually implement. The cost to sustain organizations and institutional structures over the period as well, so that it is an intent to look at the immediate cost. But you're not going to be just implementing for a year or 5 years. You're implementing over the long term. So what does that cost look like? And because, again, within the agreement, the development cooperation aspects were extremely vague. And I think that there was a dependence on money that would come through the EDF portfolios, etc. But those have proven for the region to be insufficient to really address the costs of implementation on a long-term scale. I think that is extremely important for countries that are negotiating, or even thinking about broadening and deepening their EPAs to take note of. And then the other big thing, like I said, is even in terms of the institutional kind of framework that is needed. So if you have an agreement, for instance, like the region, where you have included issues of procurement and competition and services and all of those things, that requires a certain level of institutional framework. And for us in the region, we hadn't yet built out that institutional framework amongst ourselves before the Economic Partnership Agreement. So it means then that the large part of implementation was now about now setting up and establishing those institutions. And again, if you are doing that in the context of a public service that is already constrained and already under pressure, what you're doing now is adding new institutions again. Not only cost as well, but again, like I said, managing the build out of those institutions, I think, is extremely important as well. I think the kind of third lesson, and big lesson, is that when we are negotiating, we're negotiating sometimes in a context that we think will stay, that the world will look the same as when we were negotiating, and not recognizing that so many different things can happen that can impact on implementation and change the nature of the world. So that for the region, when we signed off in 2008, we were now only just beginning to feel the effects of the global financial crisis. What that meant now, 10 years down the road, is that we have countries that are severely indebted, and that indebtedness has meant that they now don't necessarily, again, have the resources or even have the time to pay attention to the economic partnership agreements. You now have an EU which is dealing with Brexit. And so what I'm saying is that the world will change, and that we have to be very careful that as we negotiate the economic partnership agreements, that we think about the many facets that can change as well.
We've been following the Economic Partnership Agreement negotiations for a really long time. Now the UK has decided to leave the European Union, so-called Brexit. This is going to have enormous implications, some good and some bad, for the post-Cotonou negotiations. Firstly, it provides the ACP with a real opportunity to ask the EU to rethink the Economic Partnership Agreement negotiations. Why would you continue to negotiate when one of the main markets that you were hoping to sell to is no longer there? So it's a good reason for the ACP countries to call for a pause in the EPA negotiations, but the pressure is that the UK will want its own deals with the UK. So part of the reason why I'm here is to support ACP countries to think through the implications of signing a deal with the UK and to think about putting alternatives on the table.
The question here is what lessons we draw as European civil society from our EPA experience, and now that the EU is about to negotiate the successor agreement for post-Cotonou. Well, there are several lessons that we can draw. One big lesson, of course, is that the European Union is a consolidated institution with the European Commission at the driving seat. The European Commission is an agency with a lot of power, with a lot of assets, it has the money, it has the people, it has the drive, it has also the legal basis to do its work, and it has a unified approach. Whether you talk to anybody from the European Commission here in the embassy in Ghana or somewhere in the embassy in Barbados or in Germany, you always get the same answers. And that of course makes it a very important power in negotiations like the EPA negotiations. Whereas on the other side, the ACP countries, well, they're 79, they are in 6 regions. Some of the regions have a regional integration secretariat, but it doesn't have the same power and the same means as the European Commission. So the ACP countries had to improvise how they were going to engage in the negotiations, whereas the EU Commission is an established organization that does nothing else than this. And that is of course a very big strength for the EU and a big weakness for the ACP. And we're going to see that again now with the negotiations for the post-Cotonou agreement, that on the EU side it's clear who's going to negotiate. They have a mandate, they have clear negotiating guidelines, they have a vision, they know where they want to go. Whereas on the ACP side has again to improvise a negotiating team consisting of representatives of the 6 regions. They have to come to an agreement how to go about it, and so forth and so forth. So in these circumstances, the EU has the big advantage and has ways of driving things forward. So that's one big lesson. On the other hand, the other lesson is that ACPs, even if they don't have the same capacities and force and means to do negotiations, they do know how to put up a resistance. And the EPAs have shown that even if the EU with all its might and power can ask for these free trade agreements, in the end, after so many years of negotiations, they only have a few. And the ones that they have are not so comprehensive and so deep as they would have wished for. They only obtained one comprehensive EPA, that is with the Caribbean. And with the other regions, many countries have no EPA at all. Others only have EPAs on the trade in goods. So even with their weaker capacity, ACP countries have not taken the directions that the EU wanted them to go. So these are, I think, important lessons. We have also seen that the EU, in its approach to negotiations, they try to make sure that what they negotiate fits into what they do elsewhere. So the European Union really has a global strategy. And so the post-Cotonou negotiations, they again have to fit in this global strategy. And the EU has adopted a new global strategy a couple of years ago with a clear vision. It also has a new paradigm on EU development aid, and the post-Cotonou negotiations just have to fit into that. And I don't see that kind of sense of purpose and direction and unity of vision on the ACP side. So that means that, again, the ACP side will have to find its ways during the negotiations. So we hope that they will get to learn what these negotiations are about and where they want to go and where they need to head. Unfortunately, this time there's only 2 years for doing that. So the negotiations will start in August or September of this year. And the ACP and the EU have 2 years to come with a new agreement, successor agreement for Cotonou. So that's a short period of time that will put a lot of pressure. So we can only hope that more and more people will become interested in that, and that civil society in the ACP countries will also engage, because they have also a lot of experience with dealing with the EU.